Good afternoon. My name is Trisha Beal. I'm CEO of Farm Journal Foundation. Welcome to the launch of our third annual University Speaker Series. We are proud to begin our 2022 season in partnership with Auburn University's Hunger Solutions Institute, 15 affiliated university partners, and 6 student organizations. We chose to begin this series with a focus on the issue of global food loss and waste through the lens of agriculture, climate adaptation, and nutrition. The experts you will hear from today represent the best thinking and innovation on this subject. To the hundreds of students and others joining from around the world today, I encourage you to participate in the dialogue using the chat and lend your voice to the poll questions that will be presented. I'm pleased to introduce you to the moderator of today's session, Roger Thoreau. Roger was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal for 30 years, 20 of them as a foreign correspondent based in Europe and Africa. Roger's books, including Enough, The Last Hunger Season, and The First 1,000 Days, are truly a treasure to our community, and they have enlightened and inspired the professional pathways of many countless individuals, myself included. So it's my honor, Roger, to pass the reins to you to take us off into our event today. And I just encourage everyone to get involved and be a part of the dialogue. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Trisha. Again, thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks for your very kind comments, Trisha, and the mention of the books. Those 3, which I call the Real Hunger Games trilogy. They're not stories about some dystopian world, but it's about hunger and malnutrition in our midst today, in our world today. So it's all about what's happening in the real world, as is this speaker series. And so again, a very warm welcome and enthusiastic welcome. A big thank you again to all of you joining us this morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be, for this next installment of our University Speaker Series. And again, particular thanks to all the students who are joining us today. And again, thank you, Trisha, for organizing this, to Farm Journal Foundation and Universities Fighting World Hunger, and all the sponsors and partner universities and colleges making this possible. So our theme throughout this series has been building better food systems that nourish. So looking at this nexus of agriculture and nutrition. And it's precisely at this nexus where we find our greatest challenge today. How do we both nourish the planet and preserve and protect the planet at the same time in the coming decades? How do we meet the relentless demand for more nutritious food coming from an ever-increasing and ever more prosperous global population, while also safeguarding our environment and biodiversity? We know that the very act of growing food to feed us, to nourish us, takes a toll on our soils, waters, air, climate, animals, pollinators, habitats, pushing us closer to our planetary limits. We see that all the time in our lives. Success will depend on all of us. We all have a role to play in meeting this great challenge. We all can contribute mightily to this battle to finally conquer hunger and malnutrition, no matter what we are studying and where our careers take us, no matter our skill set or our passion. Each and every one of us, each and every one of you can make a big difference. And we can start now. There's no need to wait. We know what to do. And so many of you students are already at the vanguard of this movement. So thank you so very much for what you're doing, for the clamor you're raising, for the projects you're working on, for what you're studying. Well done, and keep it up. So we'd like this session to be as interactive as possible. So please use the chat box. Let us know where you're from, what you're studying, where you are working, and please also send us your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Today, as Trisha mentioned, our topic is food waste and loss. It is one of the great outrages in our world today that as much as 1/3 of all food is either lost at the farm, trade, or processing stages, or wasted, thrown away at the retail or consumer end. There is a dismal symmetry at work here. Really dismal, troubling, tragic. That 1/3 number is about the same, be it in lower income countries where about 1/3 of food crops never even make it out of the fields or off the farm and onto plates because of inadequate storage facilities, poor transport, a lack of markets. Or in the higher income countries, that 1/3 also applies. Higher income countries like the United States, Europe, the richer precincts of the world, where about 1/3 of all processed food and food prepared for consumption is discarded, perhaps thrown away by stores for being past sell-by dates, or by consumers who forget it at the back of a refrigerator, or were too full to eat anymore. My goodness, 1/3 of all our food? The consequences on our environment. So using soils, nutrients, and water, for instance, to grow food that is never eaten. The greenhouse gases released by discarded, spoiled food. The consequences then on the availability of food and on food prices are enormous. And they are some of the reasons why hunger and malnutrition continue to abide, to persist, to increase in our world today in 2022. What's wrong with us? We can do better than this, much better. Ending food loss and waste is something we can all contribute to. After all, we're all responsible for ending food loss and waste. Doesn't this seem like perhaps the lowest hanging fruit we can surely reach in ending hunger and malnutrition? So, to explore the current challenges and examine models of promise and progress, and look at the challenges and where the roadblocks stand, we've assembled a wonderful panel today featuring 4 individuals who spent their careers, their lives, at the intersection of agriculture and nutrition. Joining us, and we see them on the screen, Patrick Webb, professor of food policy at the Friedman School of Nutrition at Tufts University, where he manages a wide range of research projects, including Feed the Future's Food Systems for Nutrition Innovation Lab. He's also a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society. That strikes me as particularly impressive. And he's also someone I have often turned to over the years. Patrick, thank you for allowing me to darken your doorstep so often as I try to understand the things that I'm writing about. Patrick's been a great help on that front. Thank you. And we also have Tim Fox, a chartered engineer and fellow of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, where he chairs the Climate Change Adaptation Working Group. He's one of our leading experts in climate change mitigation and adaptation, specializing in clean energy, heat impacts, cooling methods, and sustainable food systems. And we also have Olivia Fuller, a commercial horticulture specialist at the Alabama Cooperative Extension System through Auburn University. So Olivia grew up on a farm in Alabama and then lived in New York City, working for a rooftop farm where she was harvesting crops for food relief programs. Now, along with her work with Alabama farmers, she also grows microgreens and mushrooms and bees. And she's a Farm Journal Foundation ambassador, raising a clamor in Washington and wherever she is about what we need to be doing to end hunger and malnutrition. And we also have Rob Voss, director of the Markets, Trade, and Institutions Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute, also known as IFPRI. Previously, he was director of Agriculture Development Economics at the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, of the United Nations. So Rob and all our panelists have this issue covered on many fronts. They've been doing it throughout their careers, and now they're in front of us. So Dr. Webb is our leadoff hitter today, now that baseball season is underway, with our opening keynote address. We'll then follow with our panel discussion. So Patrick, please take it away. You're muted.
So I have to plant a tree. Here we go.
Yeah,
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Tricia. And to all the organizers, and especially big thank you to all of you who have joined to discuss and think about and wrestle with this really, really important low-hanging fruit, pun intended, Roger, but one that still isn't receiving the traction, the attention, the investment, the innovation that it deserves. So I'm going to amplify a little bit what Roger was just saying, just to set the scene before we have a panel giving question and answer session and engagement with you, all of you out there. So just six more slides. I'll keep it short. And the main emphasis that I want to put on, the takeaway messages, are these: that food loss and waste together represent a significant contribution to the planetary challenges around planetary health. That's number one. And I'll explain a little bit how. Secondly, is that food loss and waste represent an equal contributor to planetary challenges relating to health and nutrition, human health. So planetary health on the one hand, human health on the other hand, simultaneously. And as Roger said, if the goal of our food systems is to nourish planet and people, well, what we're seeing today is not that. What we're seeing today is food systems that are hurting both planet and its people. And we need to do something about that. And that's the third point, is that there is a lot to be done that can be done. And everyone here listening in, participating, has a role to play, as Roger suggested. But this is a space crying out for new ideas, innovation, energy, and encouraging governments to make, and businesses to make the right investments and to do the right thing. So I'm going to go through these, hopefully, these slides. I have to find the right thing. Right, so the first one is hurting our planet. And don't worry about the graphic so much. The key points here are that the food system isn't the only contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and water losses and soil degradation and biodiversity loss, but it is a major contributor, roughly a third. That's not just agriculture, production of food, it's the entire food system. So on the food system side, some of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, for example, methane loss or emitted from paddy rice fields where the rice has been harvested or not well harvested, left to rot, and emitting methane that way. But a lot of greenhouse gas emissions are coming further down the supply chain, the value chain that Roger mentioned, in food harvesting, storage, processing, wholesale and retail, and then of course at the consumer level, through throwing things away that were perfectly good, through processing that is inefficient, transportation that is ineffective, and so on. And as a result of that, roughly at this point, these are very hard numbers to pin down, but maybe 10% of all the greenhouse gas emissions relate to food loss and waste. Now that is a number that isn't getting out there widely enough, but it's a major focal point. We need to close that door, food loss and waste, tackling the other issues at the same time. But this is how food loss and waste is affecting planetary health. In terms of human health, there are other ways. Now, Roger used the word 1/3 food loss and waste. The latest Food and Agriculture Organization estimates are 20%. These are hard numbers to pin down. It's somewhere between 20 and 30%. Whatever it is, it's too much. We have to get rid of this stuff. And I remember, I'm sure Roger does, when I was a child, being told by my parents, eat up those last few peas on your plate. There are hungry children in Bangladesh or Biafra, right? I'm sure everyone else was too young for this. But even when I was 6 years old, I used to think, well, hang on a second. If I eat those peas, that doesn't mean there's going to be more food in Bangladesh. How on earth does that work? It took me a long time to understand that actually it does. There is an effect through food supply, through food prices, through the availability of the right kinds of foods. And it's a rather more complex system than I, as a child, could have imagined. Now, the direct effect on health is through poor quality diets. That's a global phenomenon, a global problem. Already, poor quality diets are responsible for 20% of preventable premature mortality, right? So 20% of all the deaths, all causes in the world have some underpinning in dietary related diseases of various kinds, whether undernutrition and non-communicable diseases. That's horrible. But an optimal diet requires people to have access to, be able to afford, and want to eat the right kinds of nutritious foods, fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, legumes, dairy, eggs, on and on. And the irony is that those are typically the most expensive components of a diet, particularly in low and middle income countries. And they are typically the most perishable foods, right? Compared to grains or potatoes, right? They go bad, they go off quicker. And that has a knock-on effect on availability and prices. But as then they are wasted, whether they're wasted in the market and tossed in the side of the road, or earlier on the farm, or later by the consumer, been estimated that up to around 40% of all the vitamins, all the nutrients that were produced in those foods, the dairy, the animal source foods, the fruits and vegetables, are simply lost to the consumer. And that's not just a tragedy, that is an economic inefficiency that cannot be allowed to continue. Because if we go through all the effort of producing foods that contain the nutrients that people need, and then 40% of them disappear, they have to be produced again, having again the supply side impact on greenhouse gas emissions and natural resources and so on. At the other end, and I won't belabor this point, but trying to prevent perishable foods from being thrown away can in its own right lead to food safety problems because of the kinds of foods we're talking about: dairy, meat, fruits, vegetables, and so on. So there's a real human health dimension to this story, in addition to an economic one. This is just from South Africa. Estimates that food loss and waste from South Africa can amount to roughly 2% of gross domestic product loss on an annual basis. And you can see in terms of volume, or tonnage, if you like, the greatest losses are fruits and vegetables, again, perishable. Some cereals, 26% of that is not well harvested, is lost either on the farm or in storage and processing, through loss to rodents, through toxins that destroy the quality of those foods. Fish and seafood, small amounts, but on the whole, a lot of these are perishable foods. And if you look at the value, the economic value of these foods, well, fruits and vegetables still dominate, but meat is a very high value food. Fish and other seafood, very high value. These are the foods we want people to eat in appropriate amounts to achieve high quality diets. We also want them to be produced in sustainable ways. None of this is happening. It's not being produced in sustainable ways, and it's not available in amounts that are necessary to the consumer. Now, Roger said this is a global problem, and that roughly 1/3 loss and waste is the same roughly everywhere. But where it happens in the supply chain is not necessarily the same. If you look at this chart, where in sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, Central Asia, South Asia, a large share of food loss and waste is happening after the farm. Some of it, of course, is on the farm, but after the farm, at the point of post-harvest handling, storage, processing, distribution through markets, but inefficient markets. There's a lack of refrigeration. There's a lack of good roads. Everything that conspires to make a perishable food go bad before it reaches the consumer. A lot of that is happening in that central part of the chain. So that's really, for low-income countries, resource-poor countries, that's where we need to be thinking a lot more than perhaps we have been. Don't discount the consumer. No question that consumers themselves, their choices, play a big role. And you can look at Japan, China, South Korea playing a huge role, but other high-income countries as well. These things have to be tackled in tandem. And there are solutions. This is a horrible slide, but I'm just pointing out that if you go left to right at the top, these are different steps in the value chain from production to consumption. And there are different kinds of solutions that I'm not going to go into at different elements. At the production side, improve infrastructure and access to markets, roads and storage at a bulk level to improve the chance of food moving from the farm to industry, where better storage technologies can reduce moisture, improve light, light damage, reduce humidity, and so on. Allow things to survive undamaged. But then in the processing and transformation stage, improved packaging of all kinds, lots of innovation here about drying things better, packaging them better to have a longer lifespan. And that doesn't mean that packaged foods are bad. Much packaging is essential to retain nutrients and retain quality. At the level of the market, we see a lot of this happening in some countries, promoting and supporting selling of so-called imperfect foods and moving away from standardization, where if this apple has one blemish, it is thrown away versus sold at a potential discount. And then at the consumer level, so much more can be done. Everyone here has a role to play in this, in education and information sharing and advocacy, right? These aren't the only things, but the point is multiple things have to be done at different points in the food chain across the food system. They are complementary. They are all necessary. It's not one or the other. These all need to be done to bring forward an optimal food system that can help us achieve our goal. So the final word is, we're far from that optimal food system. Our planet and our people, we're hurting. Planetary health, human health, really not good. Food loss and waste is an important contributor to that. And it's really outrageous from a natural resource perspective, from a health resource perspective, and from an economic resource perspective. Second thing is these elements of loss and waste are happening across the entire food system, not in one part, not by one player. So we have to think systemic. We have to look for solutions that are interconnected, that can work throughout the food system and raise the bar throughout. And that doesn't mean starting from scratch. There are many solutions. We have to make them more available, more cost affordable. The point there is the real game changers are not just technologies and policies. We need innovators. We need entrepreneurs. We need people to bring ideas to this place to achieve those goals, find those solutions, link them up, and enable people's choices to generate net positive outcomes, both for themselves and their entire communities and the planet simultaneously. This is why this issue is such an important linchpin of so many other dimensions in the food system that we have to take it so seriously. I'll stop there and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Love the slides, love the numbers. Thanks for updating them. Go with Patrick's numbers, not with mine, and the numbers of any of our other experts that are coming. That's where I get my numbers from. So thank you for that. And also, Patrick, thanks really for taking us through and outlining then the connections between food loss, food waste, and nutrition or malnutrition. And it's not only the loss of like food that we see being thrown away, but then you have to look at, well, the vitamins, the nutrients, everything that's in there, which is why we eat these to begin with and to nourish us. And I remember so vividly talking to you and your colleagues at Tufts when I was doing the first 1,000 days book reporting. You were also stressing so much about, the various factors that can cause childhood malnutrition and stunting. But one of the important ones is also the toxins and the aflatoxins, and from the food safety issues. So can you talk a little bit about that perhaps, and how the food loss, food waste issue is also so critical on food safety issues? Sure,
very, very briefly, and colleagues at IFPRI have also been working in this space. So aflatoxin is a natural toxin. It's not a chemical. It's something that grows. Think of a fungus, essentially, that grows, a metabolite that grows on food, all kinds of foods, whether it's grains or fruits and veg or peanuts, for example, corn, for example. If it is not if it's poor quality seed, it's not well managed on the farm, that allows then pests to drill holes, for example, into the shell of a peanut, allows these fungi to get in, and then too high temperature and moisture allows these to grow. And they are naturally toxic. It's one of the worst known carcinogens in the world. But as a result, so if we don't manage those foods on the field, and then if we store them in ways that don't protect those foods from things like these toxins, then poor consumers in the US and elsewhere feel obliged. What's the black stuff? Let me just rub it off. Don't worry, we'll still eat it. Or, God, this stuff's covered in green. I don't think I'll eat it, but I'll feed it to my cow. Right? These things are very, very damaging, both to health in the long run, but also to pregnancies and birth outcomes of young women. When what we discovered in places like Nepal, Uganda, Mozambique, is that where mothers with high levels of this aflatoxin in their blood, taken from their blood, were significantly more likely to have low birth weight children or children who were already stunted at birth than mothers who had no detectable levels in their blood, controlling for everything else. So essentially all we're saying there is that in a sense, the quality of the food matters as much as the quantity. And so we have to do what we can to protect the stuff so that it doesn't disappear, get lost or wasted, but we have to protect it in terms of its quality and its contribution to health, because if it's not good, it's not contributing to good nutrition and health.
Thank you, Patrick. And as we see, Patrick is favoring us by staying on the panel. So thanks for the keynote and everything that follows. And I also wanted to point out that we have someone that they said in the chat box, Maxwell, I think at Wisconsin, maybe the University of Wisconsin, is in fact studying this and studying the impacts of toxins and things. So thanks for mentioning that to him, and perhaps he'll rally other people then also to get more involved in this really important issue. So thank you. So next, let's move on to Tim. And Tim, so and Patrick was just talking about it with the infrastructure issues with aflatoxin throughout his presentation. So building on his comments on kind of these infrastructure related issues, what do we need to look at when or consider when we're looking at kind of engineered solutions in the world that you're in to reduce food loss, particularly in developing economies?
Okay, thank you, Roger, and thank you very much, Patrick, for that great introductory scene setter there. Really good. A lot of hooks for me to hang on as we go through the next 5 minutes. So yeah, next slide, please. What I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a few minutes explaining how the food supply chain works in a developed economy, a mature developed economy like the UK, where I'm sitting, Europe, USA, just so that you can understand the challenges that I'm going to talk about when I start to dive into the issues relating to developing economies. So I deal with something that's called the cold chain. So to explain that, that is a seamless temperature controlled system of infrastructure that goes from the farm or the point of harvest right the way through to the consumer. And all the steps in this controlled temperature supply chain use refrigeration. And if you are fortunate enough to live in the mature developed parts of the world, around 70% of the food that you consume or that you buy in the supermarket and the retail environment has arrived there either in a chilled or frozen condition. Okay, so, and in many cases that food actually didn't need to arrive in a chilled or frozen condition, but consumer expectations and perceptions are such in our economies that it does so anyway. So let's have a look at the journey. It's the Easter weekend coming up, and here in the UK, at least in England, where I live, it is traditional on Easter Sunday to cook a roast lamb. And that lamb will probably be, the favorite would be Welsh from across the border, or it would be New Zealand lamb. So let's take the one that's come the longest journey and started its journey in New Zealand. Now, while I'm talking about this could be fruit, this could be vegetables, it could be fish, but it's Easter Sunday, so I'm going to talk about lamb. So here I got a diagram that shows the journey that piece of lamb will take. So initially at the farm, when it's processed, so taken away to the abattoir. From that point onwards, it sits within a temperature-controlled environment. So at the abattoir, it would be immediately stored in a cooled environment, in a cold store within the abattoir, whilst it's being processed, and then lorries with refrigeration of their cargo containers will come up, pick up the lamb, and then transfer it through to the port. Of course, we could use railway vehicles for this as well. In many countries, that would be a railway train with refrigerated container cars. When it gets to the port, it's loaded onto a ship in a refrigerated container, a shipping container that has a refrigeration system attached to it. They'll go across the oceans to get to the UK, probably for about 8 weeks in that refrigerated container. When it arrives at the port, it's unpacked and immediately loaded into a refrigerated lorry again, or possibly a train. Then it's taken to a third-party logistics storage area to be redistributed across the UK to manufacturing plants that might turn it into cuts of meat that are pre-processed, pre-cooked. Again, then moved in refrigerated or frozen containers through to another third-party logistics store, where it gets broken down into loads to go to different parts of the country, different regions, and eventually with different suppliers, it'll end up in the retail store in the chilled or frozen container within the store. Now, in that entire journey, it has not been outside that temperature-controlled environment. So if it's chilled, it's been at -4 for the entire, at 4 degrees for the entire journey, which of course wouldn't apply to lamb, but it would apply to yogurts and things like that. But the lamb has probably come at about -18 degrees C during its journey if it's a frozen piece. And then when it's sold to the store, you take it home. One takes it home and puts it immediately in the fridge or the freezer until we're ready to take it out, defrost it, or de-chill it and eat it. Now, within the mature developed economy scenario, the loss of food within that infrastructure is incredibly small. It's just 1 or 2 percentage points of food loss, below 5% in a worst case scenario. And that loss would have come from infrastructure failure, refrigeration failures, poor handling of containers at docks or something like that. But it's a very, very small number. But yet what we have to understand is that from a sustainability point of view, all this equipment has used an enormous amount of energy. About 17% of the global electricity supply is used for refrigeration, which is a staggering number, produces huge amounts of greenhouse gases. And from a sustainability point of view, many of the elements of that infrastructure will not have been designed or constructed in a way that has sustainability or the circular economy design criteria like remanufacturing and reuse in mind. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at 2 challenges associated with this type of infrastructure. So within mature developed economies, the biggest challenge for us is that we have to retrofit and reconfigure all this infrastructure to be more sustainable and to be net zero, to be low carbon, to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. And ultimately, in countries like the UK, we're pushing for a net zero future, so a net zero sustainable cooling system. So let's have a look at what a sustainable net zero system would look like. Next slide, please. And then we'll take a look at the challenges associated with developing economies. So if we were to try to convert that cold chain to something that is a sustainable net zero cold chain, there are a number of areas that we could focus on when we're doing that. So the first thing we would think about is reducing demand in the first place. So try to reduce the amount of food we need to put through the supply system that is chilled or frozen. And I've already said to you that a certain amount of the food that goes through this chilled food system doesn't require to be chilled, and certainly doesn't require to be displayed in the supermarket chilled. But there's only a certain distance we can go with demand reduction. Demand for food is going up. It will continue to go up. And so demand reduction is going to be a very difficult stage to undertake. So accepting that we do need cold chains and we do need all that infrastructure to go with them, first thing we need to do is think about using natural sources of cooling wherever we can. So natural ventilation, natural ways of cooling, cooling areas, cooling storage areas, and vernacular architecture from countries in hot countries often points us in the right direction when we want to think about what kind of natural cooling systems we can have. So using cooling water from lakes or other natural bodies, and as I said, using as much natural ventilation as we possibly can. Then when we've exhausted all those possibilities, we need to think about using renewable sources of energy. So we start to think about mechanical engineering and harnessing renewable resources like solar, thermal, hydro, run of river hydro, etc., to power our cold stores and to provide cooling directly, not necessarily through electricity. And then when we've done that, we can look around and see if we have any waste sources of cooling available to us. And there are many types of cooling, particularly to do with air conditioning systems, etc., where the cooling is essentially being wasted, and we could tap into that. Beyond that, we need to make sure that the equipment that we're using is as energy efficient as possible, and we need to make sure that we're avoiding the use of high global warming potential refrigerants. So there are now being developed many new types of refrigerants that have much less global warming potential than the ones that are currently in use. So you may not be familiar with global warming potential in refrigerants, but they can be, some of them can be 2,500 to 4,000 times more damaging to the atmosphere than this equivalent amount of CO2. So this really is a challenge, and a lot of refrigeration infrastructure does leak, and the refrigeration is often not disposed of correctly at the end of life. And thinking about end of life, we need to be thinking about designing and constructing our system within the concept and within the methodologies of the circular economy. So thinking about reusing, remanufacturing, repurposing all of the equipment at the end of its life. And when we've done all of that, if we have any greenhouse gas emissions left that we haven't been able to squeeze out of the system, we need to think about using carbon offset and carbon removal processes and technologies. So that is a big challenge in terms of refitting, retrofitting our existing mature developed economy infrastructure. But what about developing economies? In most developing economies of the world, there is a huge deficit of this type of infrastructure. There's very little cold chain in place. But these economies are growing rapidly, they're maturing rapidly, and as they are doing so, as consumer affluence increases, demand for the sort of products that consumers expect to come through a cold chain, so meat, fish, dairy, fruit and veg, is growing. And that means that we're facing an explosive growth in the deployment of cold chain infrastructure going forward. And that means that we have to be absolutely sure that we, when we're building that infrastructure from scratch, we take the approach on the screen to ensure that we have sustainable net zero infrastructure. So just let's spend a moment looking at the reality on the ground in developing economies like India and those in sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide, please, Maddie. So thinking about how we might provide these kind of solutions in developing economies, we start to think about renewable powered cold stores, like the one shown in this picture. So this is an example from Kenya. You can see the solar array on top of the cold store itself. And this enables farmers within a farming community to literally hire storage space within the cold store on a pay-as-you-go basis. So this is an approach called cooling as a service. And it's all about paying either in terms of the tonnage, the weight stored, or the volume taken up by the storage of that produce. And this is enabling many farmers, smallholder farmers within sub-Saharan African countries and as I said, the subcontinent of India to have cooling, to have refrigeration available to them, which is out of reach to them as individual farmers trying to operate. So it comes back to Patrick's point about entrepreneurship and innovation. So next slide, please. So if we focus for a moment on India, which is another area where I do an enormous amount of work, the infrastructure deficit in India is absolutely enormous. So even today, not allowing for the growth of affluence in India and allowing for the need to increase the amount of this kind of infrastructure as climate change makes these countries hotter, even without considering that, in India, typically 40% of the fruit and veg, for example, is lost in the infrastructure system because they do not have refrigerated lorries and they lack the appropriate type of cold store. So India, for example, today needs around 62,000 refrigerated lorries just to deal with the amount of produce being moved around in India at the moment, and they only have 9,000. So that's a staggering deficit of 53,000 refrigerated vehicles today, let alone what they're going to need in the next 20 to 30 years. Now, the key point, of course, is that if we're going to put in place 53,000 extra vehicles plus, then we need to make sure that those vehicles are potentially electric vehicles and that they're running cooling systems that are sustainable. And there are many types of sustainable cooling systems, low carbon greenhouse gas emission cooling systems being developed now to satisfy this sort of requirement. India is actually quite well provisioned in terms of cold stores, but unfortunately many of them are the wrong type of cold store for the sort of produce that needs to be shipped around in a more affluent and growing society. So next slide, please. So just thinking about the end of the chain, I'm just sort of looking at the various stages that we saw in a mature developed economy, but looking at them in a developing economy. This is the typical sort of market scene in an Indian city, an Indian town on a very hot day. This produce won't last long, and it certainly won't last long at home when it gets home as a result of the damage that's being done to it sitting out in the sun. You see some attempt at shade and natural cooling, but if you compare that with walking into a supermarket or a retail store in the USA or the UK or Europe and having chilled cabinets, you can see that the shelf life isn't going to be very long. And again, there are innovators and entrepreneurs looking to develop these kind of solutions for these kind of situations and doing them from a perspective of net zero and sustainability. So next slide, please, Maddie. So here's an example. This is Cold Hub in Nigeria. So this is again a solar powered refrigerator sitting next to a market within Africa, within Nigeria, allowing produce that is received from the countryside to be put in a cold store until the retailers actually need it for their market stores. Now, of course, you know, it's still exposed in the market stall. It's not the perfect solution. It's not a chilled cabinet, but it's a step in the right direction. And of course, the produce has probably arrived heated anyway from the countryside on the back of one of those lorries I just showed. So it's going to be warm already. So final slide. This is an example of a company that's tried to get around that by producing refrigeration, solar-powered refrigeration units that have a very novel technology inside using the melting point of ice. It's very clever, called Sure Chill. I encourage you to take a look at it. But they've started to develop retail cabinets using their sustainable net zero type technology. So just a kind of a sample of the challenges we face, as Roger and Patrick have said. I mean, within that supply chain, around 700 million tons of food is wasted a year, or lost a year, I should say, which is about the equivalent of the 700 million tons that is wasted in developed mature economies. So looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Tim. I muted myself, so I was able to catch myself. So hey, thank you very much for that, and particularly for mentioning India, as you and I had talked about before. Both of us having done quite a bit of work there, you much more. Has always been striking to me that, look, if India is one of the world's leading producers of fruits and vegetables and milk, how does that match up then with India then also being the country with the largest total aggregate number of malnourished children? In particular, you figure, wow, all these nutrients, particularly as Patrick's talking about, all these nutrients, all these vitamins that are there and growing and leading producer of it, but then so many of them being lost. And so that 40% or whatever the number is that is just lost in transport, into fields, poor storage, poor transport facilities, is really profound. So thanks for mentioning that. So I wanted to go to Olivia next, because you're working in Alabama with farmers in the Black Belt counties and some of the poorest, most food insecure counties in America. I believe you're probably seeing some similar problems there in terms of the refrigeration, the storage capacity of some of these the farmers in the South, and particularly in the Black Belt counties. So please, if you can tell us some about what you're seeing and what you're hearing from farmers that you work with in Alabama, also what you'd seen in New York and organic farmers and things. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Roger, for asking me that. Growing up here, my mother would tell me, finish your plate of food, not because of hungry kids in Africa, but because of peers that I would sit next to in school, friends of mine. So I was surrounded by hunger. And that's always so shocking for people to hear that are from America and from states in the South, that I think they're aware of it. Maybe it's something that they don't want to really see and face, but the farmers here are hungry. And my first few farm visits after I was hired with Extension, I was, so excited to meet my farmers and get to know them and provide some research information for them. And I got there to some of them and realized they're living in shacks. Our farmers are hungry. And that broke my heart. I realized that a lot of the solutions that I thought that I had for them, different fertigation to put into their drip irrigation systems, they couldn't even afford the drip irrigation, but they're the farmers that their community is relying upon to feed them out of the back of their truck. And it's so important that we realize that this is a domestic situation, domestic meaning that for those of us that are here in the States, this is not something that is happening in developing countries. And especially after COVID, the amount of people that have signed up now for SNAP benefits and the hungry families that are surrounding us in countries that are often overlooked has been really awakening for me to see. I knew that I had grew up with that. I knew that I grew up in a Title I school, so a lot of the kids were stuffing their backpacks with any leftovers, anything that they would try to not eat their full lunch so that they could have dinner. They would put things in their backpacks and in their pockets and take that home. So I was surrounded by that growing up, but to then meet the farmers here, the farmers that are growing food and providing that, to see that they're hungry, that broke my heart. I remember coming home and crying the first few times after my farm visits, because this is America. How is this happening? I think from my side, from working with farmers so closely, it's important that we focus on getting them the research, the on-farm research, so that they can grow and take advantage of the land that they have. They're not making more land. You know, we hear that all the time, but they're certainly making more people. And if we could just take advantage of and help them get the resources that they need, the people that are growing food, to be able to grow the most food, the most fruits and vegetables that they can on the amount of space that they have, and even with genetics coming into play, so that they can kind of pick the best varieties of things that will thrive in our changing environment and changing climate. Those are some things that I'm seeing on farms here in the States.
And Olivia, thank you. And thanks for reminding us that, I had, when I was based in Africa with the Wall Street Journal and writing about hunger and malnutrition and writing about this cruelest irony, I think, in the world, is that the hungriest people in the world are farmers, and this whole hideous oxymoron of hungry farmers. And then to see that also in the United States, and our hideous oxymoron here of hungry Americans. These are two words that shouldn't belong in the same phrase, or just horrible to hear like that. And then also that there is no just over there anymore. I mean, we're all kind of in this together, and what one sees, elsewhere, we can also find here. So on the farmers here that you're working with, what are they struggling with in terms of the food loss here, also on the farms here? I think you had also mentioned at one time, kind of the pressure that they face from stores, from farmers markets, from other places that they may sell their food, that, there's imperfections in your food, we're not going to take that, right? So they're seeing just kind of in those market access pressures of, seeing some of their produce fall by the wayside.
Yeah, that's important, because when you focus on global food security, it's usually starch-rich cereals and overlooks the importance of these horticulture crops. Even when I say I work in horticulture, people start asking me about how to take care of their houseplants and their tulips in their front yard. And I'm just like, when are we going to, the horticulture, when is that going to be thought of as in the same breath as hunger and solving that? Because we need more fruits and vegetables in these, and I think it's underestimated the vital importance of these horticulture crops. They have the most nutrient dense things that we could ask for as consumers. And so the other side of that question is I'm seeing a lot of loss on farm due to lack of farmer education and resources being able to, get the fertilizer that they need and irrigate properly, and just having that research actually getting to them has been something that's so important. And even once they know what to do and what to grow, they can't afford to necessarily implement that all the time. So connecting them with the funding resources so that they can, it's connecting so many dots that the things are here, it's just letting them get to the right person. But on the other side of that is consumer education, I think, is something else that is incredibly important, because the cosmetic criteria that's embedded in what we perceive as quality requirements is just, it's pathetic. You don't see that. You don't go out to it. If you have a garden, you don't go out to your garden and pick things that look like you see in the grocery store. That's not what they look like. And I think the more education that we can bring to the consumers of injured, like misfits, things that don't look like what we think they should look like, can also, and sometimes that's perceived because we think they're going to have less nutritional value to them, but it's not. A lot of times, I like to use the peach as an example. An injured peach, it's going to produce more sugars and more nutrients to combat that injury that it may have. So therefore, by eating that peach that has a bruise, it's a healthier peach for you to consume. So, and that goes across the board with a lot of fruits and vegetables. They naturally produce these chemicals to help fight off whatever pest. I'm not, pest pressure is not great, but to not be so picky And to eat, even when it comes to meats, which is not an area that I work in, but I see so many of my farmers trying to incorporate different parts of their animals into CSAs, and their CSA members are not happy with it because it's not things that they know how to cook with. And if they did know how to cook it, I think they would be more willing to eat it. It would be more desirable to them. So those, I think both sides, farmer education and consumer education, are incredibly important.
Good. And thanks for pointing all that out, Olivia. Again, kind of with the theme that we've been kind of remarking from the beginning, is that, yeah, again, these are all things that we all are responsible for and we all can contribute to. Even it's just consumer behavior, right? That, you know, thanks for raising the banner of injured peaches and other bruised fruits and stuff, that they're still perfectly fine to eat, and maybe even more so, as you point out. So thank you for that. So Rob, Olivia mentioned a word close to your heart in all your work: research, getting the research into the hands of farmers, and in particular your work on, you know, on markets and, you know, market dynamics. Yeah, what are you seeing in kind of your research that encapsulates also then what's going on the food loss, food waste front, and particularly there's the impact of market dynamics on that, some of which Olivia was talking about.
Thanks, Roger, and happy to be on this panel. Thanks, everybody. Let me just first, before I get to your question, start with the point where Patrick also started. This is why we concerned with food loss and waste. And I'd like to underline what we're seeing every day now in the news, the war in Ukraine, which is likely going to cause major shortages of wheat and vegetables in global markets, pushing up world prices, food prices around the world, and which could cause millions of more people falling into hunger and food shortages. So it's a key concern why we should be worried not just about will we have enough food, but particularly also how the food system functions and how vulnerable it is to shocks. And before I get to your question, let me also add to that what we've seen in COVID-19. So even if you have the best functioning supply chains, take the United States, great supply chains, but because of COVID, farmers, livestock farmers, had to throw away millions of gallons of milk, fresh milk. Why? Schools were closed, no school milk programs, restaurants were closed, coffee shops were closed, and it was not easy for the system to quickly find new markets where to send the food to, because of the packaging and so on. So even the best organized supply chains can be vulnerable to these kinds of shocks that we're not used to. Of course, the food systems have adjusted quite well during this period, subsequently during the period, but there can be huge food losses. And of course, we also saw COVID, the kinds of issues that Tim talked about, lack of cold transportation, cold storage, just like in a country like Mali, where because of COVID, the food could no longer be transported during the night, particularly fresh fruit, but it had to be transported during the day, and subsequently got lost along the way. So there's these different contexts that we're worried about, but also, and that's what I'm going to emphasize quite a bit, we have to look at how the markets work, how also producers act in those markets, and what it then could mean for addressing food loss and waste. So if we think of what things are important to look at. So one is, and there with Tim, we need better integrated food supply chains, particularly in developing countries, because of these lack of cold storage and so on. But it may not work sufficiently if it doesn't work fully throughout the entire supply chain. So it's good for farmers if they have storage, if there's good cool transportation onto market, but then if the producer is then out for the full day in the open market with no cooling, or likewise if you have a dry chain, as we call it, that's for grains and for beans and so on, if you can put it in hermetic bags, if we teach farmers to put it in there, but then if it goes onto the open market and it's still being open, the bags are being left open during the whole day because consumers like to see their producer, producers like to make things more attractive. That's when it's important to make things work with the entire supply chain. So that brings me to my second point and how markets work. Particularly market incentives are quite important, right? Even as we see that a lot of in our measurement, in our research, we find that most of the food losses in developing countries happen on the farm. Either pre-harvest or bad handling on the farm, lack of storage near the farm. But most of the causes are beyond the farm because the farmers cannot access adequately markets in such a way that even if you have sort of easy and cheap solutions like practices bring to farmers that they timely harvest, can stay longer out there, it doesn't perish immediately in terms of also maize, as proper maize sorting, disinfecting storage facilities if they're there, and so on, which are very cheap solutions and can pay off economically. And still, we've seen that in many cases, the adoption of those solutions remains low, also those corn farmers, countries like Nigeria, Tanzania. And they will stay low if those adoption of those techniques, if the farmers expect the gains to be too low, because it may not work throughout the supply chain, either because prices are low when harvest time is there, because most do harvest around the same time, bring it to the market, prices drop. So what it needs is that the supply chain can work well for across the supply chain, and that's it's not just the storage space that's being brought close to farmers, but also that the conditions for proper conservation of produce is held up throughout the supply chain. And then that takes me to the third point, is that if that the incentives also spread out to sort of a premium on the quality of food. What we found in our research that we think of food loss, it's not so much the quantities that lost, it's the quality of food that gets lost. So a lot of say fresh vegetables, tomatoes, and so on, they're still being brought to market, but the losses in the case that the product is damaged, has lost quality, and the farmers receive a lower price for it in the market, or it only gets used for animal feed in the end. So, but then if the farmers make an effort and bring and through the improved supply chain, they can get the food in good quality to the market, then they still need the proper price because the extra cost that they have to make in order to get it in that quality to the market. So one of the things we found in our research is that things like product quality certification, and it's applied throughout the supply chain, can enormously help to reduce the food quality losses along the supply chain. Again, it's emphasizing the issue of food quality, but incentives that have to be translated into prices so that all market agents adapt to it, and also that it gets properly used within the market. And lastly, that's take me back to the point I'd raised earlier about the COVID crisis, about the Ukraine crisis, is it's important that market access is flexible for farmers, for traders and producers, and also that there's ways to adjust the sudden demand to supply shock, whether it comes from one country, being in the wheat market, because Ukraine and Russia dominate 30% of global markets for that, or for sunflower oil, because they have about 80% of that market. But also in more local markets that you can adjust to sudden demand or supply shocks by shifting either providers or shifting markets and the consumers you sell to, in order to have that flexibility and avoid food losses, food waste because of these frictions in the market. So I could go on like that, but I think those would be, I've listed 4 points that I think are critical to add to what others have said. So you can have improved technologies, you can even have improved behaviors by consumers, but if things don't work across the entire supply chain, then we may not have the impacts that we would like to have in terms of reducing food loss and waste. Which also means that the policy is not just about focusing on how can we reduce food loss, it's about how can we improve the functioning, the efficiency and sustainability of food systems at large.
Excellent, Rob. Thank you. And particularly that last point of, well, here comes some polls questions that are coming up. But Rob, thanks for mentioning the current events of the pandemic and the impact of that, the awfulness of what's going on in Ukraine, the impact of that on the global food chain. That example in West Africa was fascinating, how things that we wouldn't even think about during the pandemic, that if it's at nighttime when the farmers are kind of moving some of their products because of the cooler temperatures and things to the markets, but that was also the time of the curfew and the lockdown at those times. So then what are they supposed to do? So all these kind of ramifications that come through. So thanks for pointing out all that. I just wanted to ask about, Rob, about what if kind of your research, or there's been studies on this, kind of another current event that Americans are certainly noticing, and consumers around the world. The Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US just this morning announced that grocery prices in the US rose 1.5% in March and over 10% of the last 12 months. 12% in the course of a year. And they said that kind of year-long increase is the largest in 31 years. I read that again. I know there's a lot of factors involved in that, but to our topic on food loss, food waste, has there been research or direct correlations then, or has anybody costed that out in terms of here's what it actually cost consumers, in the grocery stores, in the markets, of the just the cost of their food? So they can tie that back. Gee, the more that we waste, the more we're paying for it to begin with. And so, another huge irony in all of this. So, Rob, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, definitely, of course, you would think that if we can reduce or eliminate all food loss and waste, then we would have more supply, and then we would have everything solved, or maybe a lot of things solved. But it certainly doesn't work that way. It's simple, right? Because what we need to look at, if we have managed effectively to reduce food loss and waste, of course, it would be a great success for food system efficiency. The immediate effect will be prices will go down. So it depends on what it means also for producers. Will they have still the same incentives to continue producing at that price level? And also, what would be the cost of elimination? So how would that translate into the cost of food on the one hand, and also the cost of producing the food on the other hand? So it's not a done deal, but our research typically shows that you have effect both ways. In general, you see a very positive effect overall of reducing food loss and waste on food availability at lower food prices. But there may also be trade-offs in the form, as I just mentioned, that may reduce some of the food production. So it's not like there's an automatism that once we have eliminated this price, then we have solved all the other problems. Right. So I think it needs to be a broader food system approach, as I mentioned before. And it maybe just to where you started out with the increase in food prices, what we're seeing now, right? So we should not think it's only because of the war in Ukraine that food prices are up, right? They were already way up last year, right? For all kinds of reasons that we've seen. It also has to do with weather shocks, and that also brings back to the points Patrick raised in his opening remarks. And we see climate change, and these weather shocks are closely related to climate change, whether it's droughts in Middle East, in North Africa, and in the Horn of Africa, and also we've seen last year in parts of South America that's holding back production, or it's floods in other parts have affected food production. So yeah, we need to think these issues through in conjunction, so that doesn't make our lives easier. But I think if we don't do it, we may think that we have the simple solution in hand, and that may not be the solution that we need.
Thank you, and thanks for reminding us of that. We're getting some really good questions from the listeners, the participants, what you call somebody on Zoom, a viewer, a listener, fellow panelists for joining us. So thank you. So we had one that was sent in kind of as she registered, so she was thinking about this, and have a number of them. Gabriella from Cornell. So Rob, with research, and Patrick and everybody, and Olivia and Tim, kind of all involved in this. So from a student perspective, and they say from a research perspective, as students are getting in, what is a topic related to food waste and everything we've been talking about that's often overlooked? If there's something that they can be, looking at, or where you would say, gee, this is where we need work coming in, or research on this. Any thoughts on that from anybody? Patrick, you're nodding your head.
I'll start quickly. I mean, one would be measurement error, which sounds really boring, but as we started saying, the estimates are very broad, right? And there's a lot of effort going on, innovation going on with cell phone technologies and all kinds of other things to try and better understand, capture what people actually eat around the world, which is not well understood yet, even. But trying to better understand what people do that we would call waste. What do they do with waste, for example, especially in low-income settings, whether in the US or elsewhere? Is it really waste if it goes to feed a barnyard animal? Is it really waste if it goes into a compost heap to generate organic matter, right? So, I mean, this requires some nuance, and we don't yet have the measurement tools or ways to assess these in a granular sense in most parts of the world. I would say that, so better identifying what the problem is and measuring it, I think for any research entity is a pretty important priority.
Good, thank you. Rob, you had some thoughts?
Yeah, I would like to reiterate one point I already made in my intervention, which is when I think of food loss and food waste, I think particularly on the food loss side, the main point is food quality loss. And that's also in our measurements for many sectors, many types of products in developing countries. That's the main share. And but it's extremely difficult to measure food quality loss, right? So we can measure it in different ways. One way we measure this by looking at what's the price of that product in the market, would that is related to the looks of the product or the quality of the product, or you can look at the nutritional value, which is a lot more costly to measure, right? But of course, if you have fruits and vegetables that are half perished but still look like a tomato or an apple, but it typically has also enormous loss in nutrition value, right? So there we have serious limits in how we measure things, whether we truly understand the magnitude of the problem, where I think a lot more research has to go into measurement, but also policy should focus on, solutions focus on how can we prevent the food quality loss along the supply chain.
Thank you. Olivia, anything?
Just add one there, Roger?
Yeah, please, Tim. Yep, Tim, and then we can go to Olivia.
Yeah, so I totally agree with Patrick on monitoring and evaluation, and that's really important. But one area that I think, from my perspective, that really needs a lot more research is around the innovative business models and innovative finance models for bringing forward renewable energy, clean energy solutions, more sustainable net zero solutions to elements of the cold chain. There's a lot of work going on the technology. There's a lot of good sort of infrastructure work going on, but all of it requires innovative financing and innovative business models to make them work. So I mentioned the idea of cooling as a service. That's something that's only been around now for maybe 3 or 4 years. Really innovative model. It's really can make a difference. So we need a lot more of that. So I'd say, yeah, please focus on financing and business models.
Excellent. Olivia, on the horticulture front, any?
Yeah, so what I think is so beautiful about that question is that kind of brings up that everybody has something to offer. Everybody, no matter what if you're a student, no matter what your major is, I feel like everybody can bring something to the table on this topic, because I thought of a few different options. As we mentioned, the consumer side of things, whether that's teaching people how to utilize vegetables that are in season. A lot of chefs that I've worked with through just selling my own produce, they'll be asking for things that, are months away from being in season. And the more that they're requesting that, the more that there's a demand. So then there's more imports of things that are causing these issues. So understanding that eating things that are in season and when they're in season. So, there's people that need to go out there and maybe be chefs and spread the word, or, teach in some capacity on that way. Something kind of the other end of the spectrum, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, but different gene editing tools. There's a lot of research that needs to happen because, as we've said, this produce has very short shelf life, and that produces post-harvest loss. So breeding new crops that retain those desirable traits and accrue less damage over the course of sometimes long supply chains. I think that proves a new and exciting front for this research, and that capacity, just producing varieties that are more susceptible to things such as different pathogens. And one last thing on farm technology. So I know when I was studying agriculture, it was quite boring at times, but there's some exciting things and different directions you could go into with studying different technologies that can help in the post-harvest on farm side. I just think it's a very exciting time to be discussing this.
Thank you, Olivia, and thanks for everybody for pitching in on that question. I just wanted to make sure before we break up and people start leaving, to get to this final question to all the panelists. That's kind of a hallmark of all these university speaker series that we do, that, a message to students. We were just talking about it on some research. What things could they be studying now? What are promising career prospects? What is your one challenge to them, or call to action to the students, or any advice to them? We'll start with Rob, because he is going to be needing to drop off. He's in Europe, so probably bedtime or something else to do. So yeah, Rob, we'll start with you, and then we'll go around the horn. A charge, a call to action, and inspiration for today's students and the dozens and dozens of that have been with us on this call.
Yeah, I think thanks, Roger. I think if all the students have listened well, they've probably picked up tons of research questions that we've already put on the table, or things we may have said that were maybe half-hearted answers to that point. But I think from my point of view as an economist, so I'm very biased on that, but particularly studying how markets work is very important. in order to understand why food loss and waste is happening. Right? It's not like people want food loss and waste, but simply there are inefficiencies in the markets, in our systems. And so even with the best technologies, I gave a few examples, it may still not work well for a producer if you're a business man, if you woman, and I would consider farmers as business people, as well as traders and everybody along the supply chain. So I think that's particularly looking at what would be the right kind of incentives needed for food systems to change in the right direction. And they could start thinking for themselves as a consumer, what would you like to see change for you to make different decisions in what you eat and what you buy? Is that the price? Is that something else? But then there will always be characteristics that the demand that the market is able to meet that kind of demand. So I think it's a broad area, but I think within that is a ton of scope to do new research and have very good PhDs coming out of that. And actually, one of my research assistants just finished her PhD in Wageningen University on this kind of topics. And she did very well on that. So it can be a career.
Excellent. Yeah, and we'll be looking forward to a whole raft of PhDs coming out of this, master's themes and all sorts of things. So thank you very much, Rob. And thanks for mentioning as you did that. Yeah, that through this whole discussion, which has been fascinating and fabulous, a lot of the questions that had come in before from the students that I see coming up in the chat box, we've kind of answered along the way. So, the impact of consumer behavior, of, choices that consumers have. Is it an abundance of too many choices that we have that, ends up throwing a lot of things away? Models and practices that we're seeing, be it from, the cooling systems and refrigeration and composting and other, models that Olivia mentioned. So, that we've gotten to a lot of these, and, somebody had asked also at Cornell about in what way can the medical field help mitigate food waste itself run effects. I think Patrick can also, talk about this, that, in the medical profession, I've heard from so many doctors that said in all their years of preparing to become doctors, the time that they spent on nutrition, on issues like this, maybe a half an hour, maybe an hour, a part of a day through all those years on this. So yeah, that kind of the medical profession is, centers a lot more on nutrition, on these efforts, these whole aspects of food waste, of markets and things like that. And again, the quality of the food, in addition to the quantity, that it's in what's being lost in the vitamins and minerals and everything in food waste. So that's a big thing for the medical field to be looking at. So back to the great overriding question, then a message to students, inspiration, career advice, study things. Tim, what would you say about that?
Yeah, so thanks, Roger. Yeah, I think one of the most exciting things about this topic, food waste and food loss, food wastage overall, is that it doesn't matter what you're studying at university or college, there's a place for you within developing the solution to this. So it's one of the most multidisciplined, multi-sector, areas that I've ever come across in my career. It's an area where everybody needs to get involved, from right the way through, from social scientists, consumer behavior at the tip of the food waste end, right the way through to, the sort of the maintenance engineers, out in the field in Africa and India. And I think there's a place for everybody within this, and there's so much innovation needed and so much entrepreneurship needed to meet this challenge that I think if you want to get involved, there's a place for you.
Thank you, Tim. And particularly, as you said, kind of across disciplines, across faculties, and not only kind of the breadth of it, but then everybody working together on this. And so, I know that when you're in the field or any engineering projects, you are working with the finance folks. You're working with the social scientists. You're obviously working with the with the farmers, with the entrepreneurs, with architects, with everybody, with engineers. And so that working together is so vitally important, along with the breadth of whatever you're studying, but don't go about whatever you're studying with blinkers on.
No, collaboration is key.
Exactly. That so many other people are also involved in these efforts on different fronts. And for you to be as successful in what you're doing, that depends on the success of everybody else that is also working on these issues and working together. So it all comes together. So Olivia.
Yeah, it feels kind of funny being on the other side of this question and not a student trying to figure it out anymore. But sometimes these numbers are incredibly intimidating to hear. And especially growing up in a community that everyone was quite hungry, it was discouraging, and I wanted out of agriculture. I wanted far, far away from it. So I moved to New York City, and I thought, okay, I'm free from it now. And that was when I started working on a rooftop farm. And I realized local food does kind of prevent at least some parts of these issues. It gets the food straight from the farmer to the consumer, and the farmer then gets more of that money, because as we talked about the prices at the grocery store going up, well, the farmers aren't seeing that. So keeping food hyper local when possible is one of the solutions I've seen. And the other side of that, local food in New York City was kind of rough. So we made it, took advantage of what we had, and that was a lot of roofs. So we grew food on those and grew a lot of food. And people that I was surrounded by in the ag world were kind of joking and laughing at, oh, you think you're, solving world hunger up there on that roof. And we really were donating a lot we counted them in calories. We donated a lot of calories to these food banks because we took advantage of the space we had. And that was what kind of sparked that interest in me again and got me back into the world of horticulture, was feeling like, one, I could make a difference, and two, knowing how much food you can grow with such little space. And I don't think that, especially here in Alabama, land access is not a huge issue. So looking at things differently, looking at your roof differently, looking at your front yard differently, just knowing how to keep things super local and grow food wherever you are.
Thank you, Olivia. I love that charge. Look at your roof differently, right? Look at your environment differently. How can we, what are we doing? What can we contribute to this? So yeah, thanks a lot. And yeah, I know that horticulture, I know some of the students here at Auburn. Jesse's been listening in. A lot of great work being done on that front. So thank you for that. Patrick, we'll leave you with the last word. Since you started it off, you were our leadoff batter. You can be our cleanup hitter.
Okay, here we go.
Well, so
clear the bases. So
clear the bases.
Yeah, you mentioned yourself everyone needing to work together, and we got Rob highlighting economics, Tim highlighting engineering, Olivia highlighting agriculture, horticulture. And the point is, clearly, it's not one or other, it's all of those together. Working together takes effort and persistence and is not always rewarded, right? So that's the downer side of this. Yeah, it's absolutely essential going forward. This has to be the way we work together across disciplines, across sectors, across solutions. But it doesn't come easy, and it's not always rewarded by the people who pay you, and that has to change. We have to better demonstrate how working together is more effective, more cost effective than trying to work in silos and the cost of all the damage that has been done. So the more everyone out there can think about it this way, the better. From a research or a science perspective, I see it, same issue, but I see it as the solution. Not understanding the problems, but identifying the solutions going forward are more likely to reside where these different disciplines and sectors intersect, right? Maybe where they bump heads, rather than in the very middle of an individual discipline, drilling deeper and deeper and deeper for a solution that actually isn't there. The solution is where multiple disciplines come together and offer value add. Right, so that requires all of you to be bridge builders, to be advocates, and to bug people, to be persistent in pushing forward this important agenda, and never take no for anything.
Yep. Thank you, Patrick. Great way to end it. I love it. Yeah. Bug people, be persistent. I call it raising the clamor. It's the least that we can do. What's going on with this? What's wrong with us? Why do we tolerate all these things still in our world? And I'll just, kind of sum up by saying thanks to all the panelists, to all the students, to everybody who participated in this and listened in, tuned in, viewed in. And know that you can make a big difference in this imperative to nourish the planet and save the planet. As we've been saying, there's a role for every one of us, no matter what you're studying or your skill set. If you have a passion to join the fight to end hunger and malnutrition, please do. There's something we can all do. Each and every one of you, be imaginative, be creative. There's a way for each of us to make a contribution. Please raise the clamor, lead the way, inspire. And on that note, Tricia has reappeared on our screens. So thank you all for joining us, and back to Tricia to wrap everything up and send us on our way to the next one of these series.
Well, first of all, thank you to our esteemed speakers. My word, that was just, I think everyone learned a lot today. Everyone, no matter our experience level, learned something new today. It was an excellent presentation. And to our participants, I don't think we've ever had a more engaged group on chat. It was just really phenomenal to see what was happening on chat, just interchanges and questions. And I thank you all for that. And on that note, we have 3 more segments of our speaker series coming up this year. We'll have another one later this summer, again with our friends from the Hunger Solutions Institute, and then 2 live events coming up this fall. So get ready for that. One coming to you live from the World Food Prize in Des Moines, Iowa, and a second coming to you live from the COP27 in Egypt. So we're really excited about that. And what we'll be exploring in our next 3 segments will be the intersection between agriculture research and development, climate adaptation, and nutrition. And all of this with the overarching lens of policy. So that's where we really like to bug people. I love that. So until then, please have a great beginning to your summer, and be kind and bug people. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.